Welcome to AP U.S. History. We'll be looking at the 70s and 80s, seeing some of the highlights and things that perhaps might appear on the AP exam. Certainly, Nixon is going to be the president during the 70s. We've talked about him in other presentations. One of the things that he will shift is to a policy of détente, a softening of our stance against the communists instead of brinkmanship, trying to negotiate with them. He will send Henry Kissinger to China and USSR for secret sessions to plan a summit. Nixon believed the USSR and China clashing over interpretation of Marxism and also border disputes gave the United States an opportunity to play one side off against the other. And he was also hoping to gain some support from either the Soviet Union or China to pressure North Vietnam to sue for peace. Soviet poster peace in both Russia and in English. So Nixon, under Kissinger, he was Secretary of State. Realpolitik is what it was called, basing U.S. policies on national interest rather than on political ideologies. Sort of a pragmatist approach, whatever works best for the United States. Certainly there was a balanced power. It was a safer world if we have a strong, healthy United States, Soviet Union, Europe, Japan, and China. That was his thinking. He will be able to visit China in 1972 with the help of Kissinger arranging that trip for him. And this will pave the way for the United States recognizing China in 1979. And they have become a huge trading partner to the United States. This is Nixon greeting Mao Zedong, the communist leader of China, in 1972. Nixon addresses a banquet in China, trying to improve relations between the United States and China. U.S. will support China's admission into the United Nations and pursue economic and cultural exchange. Soviet Union and détente, that is trying to be more agreeable with the Soviets, try to get a missile reduction. Soviets wanted U.S. foodstuffs, so they were more than willing to talk to the United States. And there were also one of the reasons they were talking to the United States is because they were fearful that the Chinese and the United States might become too close. Both nations wanted to reduce their nuclear arsenal. SALT I was signed in 1972, and this is both agreed to stop making nuclear ballistic missiles. Those are the ones that reach each other's continent. Well, these ballistic missiles, the ABMs, were missiles that were aimed at knocking down incoming missiles, and so we're looking to make things more peaceful during Nixon's administration with the communists. Both U.S. and Soviet Union wanted to reduce the ballistic missiles, those missiles that can reach each other's continent. Anti-ballistic missiles, this was to shoot down ballistic missiles, and they agreed to reduce those. New federalism is in terms of politics, that is, giving more responsibility to state governments to administer different programs. He felt that state governments, local governments knew best rather than the federal government. He also believed in this idea of revenue sharing, giving more money to states. Sounded good on paper, but they sort of ran out of money. In terms of civil rights, Nixon sought to block the renewal of the Civil Rights Act. He tried to stop forced busing to achieve integration. Wasn't too popular with the African American crowd. He did push affirmative action for women and minorities. He did, that is, setting quotas. Um, some of the legislation approved by Nixon during his presidency increased Social Security benefits and food stamps. The Federal Election Campaign Act, which was supposed to control the amount of spending in campaigns and how much lobbyists could give to different campaigns. He established OSHA, which was to increase job safety. He is considered an environmental president. He established the Environmental Protection Agency to clean up the water and air. He also helped see the Endangered Species Act. He signed that into law to protect wildlife. This is an emblem of the EPA, trying to protect the environment. Scandals in the White House. The Watergate break-in was a huge scandal. There were men who broke into the Democratic headquarters in the Watergate Hotel in D.C. Were trying to recover information as to what the Democrats were going to do in the campaign. They were arrested, but the accused remained silent. Eventually, two reporters will link these men to the White House. G. Gordon Liddy is going to spend some time in jail. He fell on the sword for the president. It was never proved that Nixon approved it, but he certainly covered it up. Told people, the American people, that he had no knowledge of that. Eventually, the scandal will reach the president, and he will be forced to resign because he kept track of tapes. He made recordings of conversations in the White House, and these were very incriminating tapes that proved that he was obstructing justice. He would have been removed from office. He is. Impeachments are in the process. Before it's formalized, he resigns in disgrace. They may ask you a question about that, but certainly it'd be one or two. But the Watergate break-in was a cover-up, and eventually it's going to he's going to have to go resign because the Supreme Court is going to say that he needs to turn these tapes over to the Congress so that they can listen to it. Of course, this is Rosemary Woods, who said that she inadvertently erased some of the tape. Whether she did or not is never proven. But he will resign on August 7, 1974. Gerald Ford will take over. There was something called the Imperial Presidents under Nixon. That is, from World War II on, the president seemed to have been gaining more and more power with the loss of power from the Congress. If he didn't want to spend money that was allocated by Congress, he didn't do that. He certainly invaded Cambodia without congressional approval, and he used the FBI and the IRS to harass his political opponents. Nixon acted above the law, part of this imperial presidency, and he's eventually going to meet his demise in disgrace. Now, in terms of how Congress responded, they did pass the War Powers Act in 1973, which said the president can only send troops over for 60 days, and then they would have to, after 90 days, get approval for spending for the troops. Also, the Congressional Budget and Impoundment Act was passed, which said that if the president wasn't going to spend the money, that it would be reverted back to Congress. The Privacy Act, making sure that people were not spied on by the government illegally. Gerald Ford may ask a question during his administration. He will take over after Nixon loses the presidency in disgrace. Something called stagflation, that was high unemployment and high inflation during his administration. One of the reasons that he probably was not elected is he pardoned Nixon. South Vietnam will fall in 1975, and we will do nothing to stop that. This is a picture of President Ford. Ford was the first person approved or appointed by the 25th Amendment. That is, a vice president, new circumstances for how you selected a vice president after the presidency was vacated. Uh, Many, again, felt that his pardoning of Nixon cost him the White House. This shows the presidential election between Jimmy Carter and Ford. Jimmy Carter is going to be a one-term president. Um, he was somewhat of a micromanager. He believed all decisions had to go through his office. He did create the Department of Energy to help deal with the oil crisis, which created long gas lines during his administration. He was plagued by a recession during his presidency. Um, he did approve deregulation of airlines, so the federal government no longer controlled airfares and routes. It was more competition. Did create a super fund to clean up pollutions. As far as his foreign policy was concerned, probably humanitarian diplomacy. He sought to base foreign policy on human rights. Foreign policy should be based on principles rather than compromise. He will give away the Panama Canal in 1999. Probably his biggest achievement was the Camp David Accord, where he brokers a peace between Egypt and Israel. He officially recognized China in 1979, something that Nixon had started back in 1972. He signed the SALT II agreement, which further reduced nuclear weapons. This shows Carter handing over the Panama Canal. This shows him, Menachem Begin, Jimmy Carter, and Anwar Sadat signing this peace treaty. During his presidency, the Soviets invaded Afghanistan in 1979. And retaliation, détente sort of came to an end between the Soviet and the United States because of this invasion. Carter stated that he would use force to protect the rest of the Middle East from the Soviet Union. We stopped grain shipments and withdrew SALT II negotiations. We will boycott the Summer Olympics in 1980 when the Soviet Union was hosting it. We will support the freedom fighters with arms through Pakistan, giving it to the Afghan freedom fighters, which now seem to be the people that were fighting in Afghanistan today. Soviets, again, spent about 10 years in there and eventually withdrew. One of the real dark points in his political career was the Iran hostage crisis in 1980, where America's embassy people taken into Iran are going to be held for about 444 days. Part of this was led by the fact that Carter allowed the Shah to come to the United States for medical treatment. And Carter was seen as inept and weak because of this, and he will lose his election to Ronald Reagan. And we'll